Our next presenter is Laura Rericha. Laura is going to address Symbiosis, ants, and Carex. Laura, please.
So I wanted to talk a lot about ecology today because plants do not stand in isolation. They are integrated among a network of ecological interactions, which are paramount not only for dispersal, but also for pollination. And it's essentially a circle in how it repeats itself. So as you can see, we have ants, which I will talk about on today's program, but also some of the seeds are ant dispersed. And without that dispersal, we would not have pollination because of the germination of those seeds and the flowers, which are pollinated by bees. And we'll talk about one species that is on the slide. But first, let's talk about remnant versus de novo sites. And unlike a garden or restoration or something, a habitat that is started from scratch, when we're talking about remnants, these are very complex ecosystems that have their relationships tied to the time involved, which is extremely long, well beyond a generation time of a human being, to become established. And the assembly of these complex relationships are a part of that regime. The other thing is that they are also very complex, and with the incorporation of soil organic matter, which we will really dive into, is paramount to the complexity of these systems, because without it, we just would not have the species richness either at the ground level for the herbaceous community, but also the remnant microbial and soil animal communities. And then I also want to mention that, and especially when I do my programs on bees, that all depending, because humans, we go out into woodlands in the spring, we had that long winter sojourn, and we become quite beguiled that these are rich systems if we're talking about a woodland. But within that vernal window, without management, such as from fire or because of our lack of understanding of that system, such as removal of non-native species, these can turn into quite poor ecosystems in that, because sunlight is extremely important, because not only are the plants, but also the insects ectothermic, and that they derive their energy and their ability to thermoregulate from the outside air temperature. And if we don't have that sunlight that is driving both photosynthesis at the ground level, but also that combination, their ecology with, in this case, ants, and also the bees and other insects that are related to plants, then if we do not have that large bracket that spans that growing season, then we are really omitting a great proportion of potential biodiversity within these remnants. So, and most of our the highest quality remnant landscapes, and these are original and largely unmodified by man, and hopefully not seeded, because with the abiotic influence of fire, that is instrumental to the reestablishment and the resorting of many of these systems that have become adapted to such forces. So, but it first begins with the soils, and remnant soils are replete with organic matter, and all depending upon the soil order that we are talking about. It all depends on the incorporation and how deeply that soil organic matter is within the soil profile. And it's all related to, well, the pedosphere, which is the soil, is related to the biosphere, which includes the life forms that are integrated among that, and also the atmosphere and the hydrosphere. So all of these interconnections are all paramount to the establishment of soil organic matter, which is produced from the organic components within the system. The soil organic matter is just not something that you would buy at Home Depot in a medium that to plant in your garden. It goes well beyond that. And this is part of the reason when we destroy, that would be a complete disallowance to allow the system to continue. But even when they become degraded and without thinking about that phenological aspect that I had just shortly mentioned, there are 3 different reservoirs that potentially can build within these remnants. And of course, the first one is the short. And these humic acids that are produced, and only the plants that occur throughout the world, it's first the plant residues that form the largest reservoir of the organic matter. They contribute yearly to the soil organic matter, and then the animal population, which feed or are either primarily or secondarily affiliated with the plants. But it's usually 1 to 5 years where the growth and the dying of the plant species they incorporate that within the upper layer, and then becomes the medium to more longer lived, more resistant soil organic matter. So it goes from 1 to 5 years, 20 to 40, and then it's 500 to 1,000 years. So when we destroy these reservoirs, or we don't have that consistent input within the soil organic matter, within the soil profile, depending upon the soil type, we are largely eliminating or creating a deficit and a gap. And that's largely a part of the ability of these systems to sustain. But getting into chemistry, what's extremely important that the 2 colloidal fractions within soil organic matter is clay and also the humus component. And these are, and we'll talk only about humus, but they have a large surface area, and then because of the time factor involved in the previous slide, and because of their net negative charge, if we're dealing with chemistry, those of you that have had chemistry, and just like a magnet, you have a negative and a positive and they attract. Well, the same also goes with the ions, and these are hydrated, meaning surrounded by water molecules, cations that are positively charged, and there are anions, which are negatively charged and hydrated ions within the soil. And as you can see is a root here, and it's just an even exchange. And just imagine that if I give something, then it takes it back. So we have the root that sends out protons or hydrogen ions that have just 1 positive charge, and has to send out 2 of them in order to get the 2+ charge of calcium or magnesium. So for potassium, it would have to send out just 1 proton, and this constant give and take. What's interesting about this is that the soil organic matter is a reservoir of plant nutrients, but also because of the hydrated nature of the cations and the anions, that we have water within this medium, which is extremely important, and largely because of the specific heat of water. And I'll talk about that in just a moment, but showing the hydrated cations. And also, our sandy soils, especially our upland soils, and particularly those that are entosols, which such as wind rework sand or our aeolian systems with our dunes, these are nutrient-poor systems unless we have organic matter that is concentrated directly with the graminoids primarily, beyond Carex, okay, or the Symbiosis. But it is because of the growth and dying of the root zones that organic matter is always produced at that nexus of where that graminoid, in the broadest sense, exists. So sand particle silicon dioxide is inert, okay, so it does not have a negative charge, and so nutrients cannot electrically bind to that medium, okay, unless you have humus, your soil organic matter, that is affiliated with the root zone. So for that reason, we have this phenomenon with the organic matter concentrating around the roots, And because ants, in this case, and other soil-dwelling organisms, they do not do well with extreme fluctuations in temperature because they are ectothermic. So this is a diagram showing in a pure mineral soil, and you have the incorporation of a graminoid, so this could be a grass or a member of the Cyperaceae, such as Carex pennsylvanica, and as you can see, the brownish coloration around the root zone, that is precisely where the ants are nesting within this largely mineral environment. And it's because of the specific heat of water. And what that means is that water is a miracle, in that it stabilizes the temperature. And humus, because of its large surface area and because it is constantly being replenished and also depleted, it's a system that has developed. It takes 1 kilocalorie, okay, so just 1 calorie to raise 1 gram of water, or 1 cubic centimeter, 1 degree Celsius, where it would take 0.2 degrees if it was a purely mineral soil absent of humus, and of course absent of water, because remember, silicon dioxide or sand is an inert surface. To heat the soil up 1 degree Celsius. So it takes 80% more energy in a watery environment or a water replete environment such as humus to raise that water temperature. So what this diagram shows, that at the surface, and this is from doing tens of thousands of soil probes with a large soil probe throughout our region, throughout the Midwest. And I was, after understanding where ants lived, there had to be a reason why we were only finding them in certain environments, and they were always affiliated with the fibrous root zones of the graminoids. And that was because, and this is a 75-degree day, at the surface, we would have to penetrate about 20 centimeters below grade in order to attain that nice air temperature or soil temperature that approximates the soil temperature in which is near the surface, and it does not change. It is extremely stable, and even on a 90-degree, 95-degree temperature day, the soil temperature, it just fluctuates by 1 degree Celsius, a couple of degrees Celsius, and so it's an extremely stable medium. So you can see why the ants have co-evolved with nesting with the graminoids and the sedges. So first, when we look at the paradigm that I will be introducing, we have to understand that these are if-then paradigms, that once you begin to understand that we begin from the wettest of environments to the driest of environments, there are analogs as far as where the ants are nesting in the relationship with sedges within the environment. But first, we're going to begin with Carex stricta, which is an extremely important species and common throughout the Midwest. And Myrmica fracticornis is the principal hummock former of this species. And it's extremely important because some hypotheses, historical hypotheses, were such that people thought that these hummocks that would develop, or stools, columnar stools within the sedge environment, were caused by the tramping down of by cows within these environments, and that how can such a system evolve? You know, as far as it seemed to be like a recent phenomenon. So after dissection throughout the Midwest of thousands of Carex stricta hummocks and other members of the Phacocistus group, one of them Haydenii, which is commonly found in sandy systems, Myrmica fracticornis was a part of this paradigm. And this species, Carex stricta, it is short rhizomatous and does form dense wefts in its initial stage of formation. And this obligate wetland ant species will initially build about a 3 to 5 centimeter dome mound comprised of finely shredded plant parts that it glues together with organic soil, which they constantly have to reincorporate because of oxidation, okay? But for some other species, which is very interesting, and you can study with your hand lens, the oxidation of the organic matter, especially because we're dealing with also mineral environments, you can see a patina, a crystalline patina that covers the outside of these small mounds. So because the sedge is perennial, so also are the ants, and so the sedge rhizome matrix marries with the ant nest matrix, and it begins to vertically rise, and within that and grow as the years advance, and within that system are the galleries, where the ant will overwinter, typically right above the water line, even in our northern winters where we go well below 50 degrees Fahrenheit for our average annual daily temperature. And because the soil water sustains and marries with the average annual daily temperature. And so what's interesting as well is that during the vernal and throughout the estival and the autumnal window during the growing season, they produce their brood. And so at the apex of these columnar columns consisting of the sedge root matrix, they also finely shred the plant parts of the sedge and the ambient plants within the community, and they will put their brood, which consists of the larvae and the pupae. And the pupae are naked and without a cocoon, unlike some other species within the Firmicida. And the workers will tend back and forth, depending upon the temperature, the ambient air temperature, to have that precise recipe as far as how to move or where to move their brood, depending upon environmental conditions. In addition to a very elongate chimney-like structure that is also consisting of the finely shredded plant parts that is also riddled throughout. So you will see that the ants have incorporated the brood both in that very shallow detritus-like zone at the apex of the hummock, but also within that column. And this is an example of a Carex stricta stool. Also, because of the nest-keeping activities of the ants, they also plant other plants that are non-ant associated as far as their seeds, which we'll talk more about in a minute. But they also will decorate their mound nests, and also because we may have woodland species that are growing on these sedge hummocks, and that differ from what we would see within the ambient environment. So there's Gallium triflorum. So here is an example of the chimney-like structure that I pulled apart the nest. So it could be leaning, it could be upright. And there's Myrmica fracticornis, and you can see the incorporation of organic matter, the humus that is among the larger detritus. And I had opened it up partially. Another species strongly affiliated with our sedges of the Phacocystis group is Myrmica lobifrons. Now this species, it behaves in the same fashion as Myrmica fracticornis, but what it does is that instead of building the large chimney structure, it will have a 2 to 5 centimeter depth of detritus consisting of finely shredded plant parts that encompass the apex of the mound, and that is where the brood is developed. And this is a species of mainly cold water discharge areas such as fen systems, but also of bogs. So it has not a wide ecological amplitude as far as temperature because we're dealing with humus-rich environments, but it's always allied with the sedges. Lasius minutus, this is an extremely high quality ant species that is an indicator of very high quality prairie fen systems. And the yellow ants, and I won't go into their taxonomy here, and you'll see more of them. They build large mound nests consisting principally of organic matter that they build in a mound, but usually surrounding Carex stricta, but also Carex pallida. Carex pallida is another member of the Cyperaceae, to where ants create these hummocks, and this species is one of them. And it's hard to see because it was a sunlit day, but of a large mound. And these are species that largely do not leave the nest. They are, and you have to really pull apart the or disturb the soil to even view them. But on the first tergite, the first abdominal segment, this species has characteristically long hairs that it will compare against closely related members, that how we differentiate. And here we have the pupae, or these are the larvae of Lasius minutus. Dolichoderus pustullatus is one species that does not nest within the root zone, but is allied with the sedges, in that because it is a well-drained, the stool or hummock is a well-drained substrate, they will nest within the detritus, such as the recently fallen or curled over leaves of Onoclea sensibilis, or sensitive fern, but also within galls on the same nest. So here we have Onoclea sensibilis, and this is another species, as you can see on your right, the finely shredded plant fibers that are hold together like a web the vegetation in order for it to do its nest activities. Here's a gall caused by a moth on Solidago gigantea, Gonora meschema, Galeosolidaginus. And so this may be a broken off stem from the previous year's growing season. And Formica ulcae, now this is in the northern portion of our region, and principally in like Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, within the transition zone and northward into our Canadian provinces. This is a species that is quite frequent and nests largely within, for our area, because the soil temperatures so if you can think of average annual daily temperature, and you were to see this mapped out across the continent, you see that species will default to nesting within open environments, okay? The further south that they go, because the water within these discharge systems is at the average annual daily temperature. Okay, and so it is a cool system that differs from what they have within their more northern environments, to where they're primarily adapted. So in our prairie fen systems, this species can be found with Carex stricta and Carex pallida primarily, but in our northern areas, affiliated with Carex communis and Carex pennsylvanica. And as you can see, the head, this is one of the hallmarks of the group, the Execta group of ants. It has a cordate head, or it's concave at the apex or vertex. So now we're moving into the more mesic portions as we go up the catena of the environment. And now these two species that I'm showing, and which we will be talking about a little more because of these paradigms, they also will nest in wet environments, and using Carex stricta and Carex lacustris is another example, Carex pallida, Carex haydenii, as a substrate to allow them to nest. But in the mesic phase of the catena, they will nest in soil mounds that they create. And later I will introduce to where then the log in various stages of decomposition will allow them to, it's the analog of the Carex stricta hummock in the broadest sense, okay? And so here we have the mesic environment. These are usually high water table, but usually quickly drained and sandy areas in this case. And note that Carex pennsylvanica is incorporated on the periphery of these nests. So Lasius claviger is a very common species. Lasius imbratus. Lasius imbratus, for Carex stricta and other sedges of wetlands, it builds a large mound nest, but with the central core being the the sedge. So with that in mind, and looking at, now we're moving up the Katina, now we're in the dry mesic to dry phase. And, you know, there are mesic environments within our woodlands and our upland prairies. And this is where Carex pennsylvanica, Carex albicans, Carex communis, et cetera, this is where they principally will be found. And especially for Carex pennsylvanica at the dry mesic to dry phase of in the woodlands, and Myrmica smithana and Myrmica sculptalis, and very uncommonly, and I'll explain in a moment, Lasius flavus. They are intimately allied with nesting in these Carex pennsylvanica wefts, and you can imagine that as we seeing a dense sward of it, not only is it very important for nesting, but also important for the incorporation of other members that are myrmecocorous, which I will bring up in a moment, and to have their seeds dispersed by ants. So this is one species that is a part of that. And, oh, excuse me. I'm going to use the... So at the base of the perigenium, when it's fresh, as you can see, there is two textures. You have the upper portion of the perigenium, but the spongy lower portion of the perigenium, and that is distributed by the ants. And the ants will take the seeds and carry them like a little torch back to their nest. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But Myrmica sculptalis and Myrmica smithana, which those names you will not see in Paul's book, but in our book, The Flora of the Chicago Region, but as abbreviations for Andre Francoeur's work, and he has yet to publish on these species. So they are shown as anacronyms of AF, representing Andre Francoeur's work, and SMI for smithana, and SCU for sculptalis, okay? But similar to Myrmica fracticornis of wetlands, which that species will never be in these environments or habitats, it nests within the fibrous root zone, within these alpha sols largely. And the alpha sols are important, and I will be showing a photograph, in that they have a very shallow organic layer at or near the surface, and it's extremely vulnerable, especially in fine textured soils where you have a fine silt loam, and especially where clay is involved, that when we diminish the sunlight from the lack of management, whether it be through burning or both from burning and the removal of invasive shrubs and other plants, then you have the diminishment of the organic matter, and which is extremely thin in these situations. And so the root zone, the fibrous nature of Carex pennsylvanica, and the organic matter that is established just around the root zone primarily forms a structure for the integrity of the ant nest. And these species also will have like a chimney-like structure, but yet it is a mound, a small mound that is evocative of the mound first created by Myrmica fracticornis in wetlands that was affiliated with the Carex stricta and other sedges in the broadest sense. And those, again, are nursery chambers. And instead of having the fine textured, finely shredded plant parts of the sedge hummock, okay, that layer absent of the chimney, they spread their brood on the open soil, and they move the brood back and forth, that is mimicking the dappled sunlight within these woodland systems. And it's quite beautiful. Now, Lasius flavus and Brachymyrmex depilis, and that's Jerry's hand. These are extremely tiny ants, but very, very important and indicators of system health, especially for savanna systems, that when you are monitoring for other animals within the system, and to know that you are within a remnant that is woodland, you're restoring back to savanna conditions by restoring the sunlight, Brachymyrmex depilus and Lasius flavus only nest within that O horizon and very shallow A1, A2 soil horizon that is very rich in organic matter and abruptly stops where we get the pure mineral soil in these alpha sols because of the alluviation or movement of clay further down within the soil profile. So by finding these ants, you know that it has been a strong success, but it's only within these swards of Carex pennsylvanica because it is a rhizomatous species and has the propensity to form large areas that mimic the sunlight and where it is located. And here is a diagram or a photograph that you can see the organic layer, the A1, A2 horizon, if it is available, the A2. And typically in our fine textured soils, the silt loam complexes, you'll see that there's barely any A1 horizon available, and it's largely mineral. And remember the specific heat of water. So if we're largely dealing with little or none or concentrated of the soil organic matter, it's going to be a system that is largely absent of conservative insects. And then here's one. I'm sure it's along the edge of a woodland, but shown here where you can see that abrupt difference between the organic layer and the mineral component. And they nest. Now imagine these are very short. If you were to pull out Carex pennsylvanica, for example, you would see that it is only shortly fibrous, where most of the root zones in the aerobic area of the soil profile where oxygen is readily available, that's where the roots are concentrated. That is primarily where the organic matter that, especially in the labile or recently incorporated within the soil, is provided. But it can go deeper, but that's not where the ants are located. Formica subsericea and other allies of this group, such as Formica subanescens, Formica glacialis, these are species of woodlands, but also wetlands. And again, using Carex stricta as the analog either of the mound environment within dense wefts or of the log environment, which you're going to see next. But these species are so interesting because not only do they disperse seeds of other plants that are allied with ants and they depend upon their dispersal, but other species of insect, of ants as well, that nest and nearly wholly depend upon these sedge hummocks and also the soil mounds created by these ants. And you might liken it, and I bring birds here, to niche partitioning within the system, because it's not just when we look at something, we think that is it. Here's the answer. It is easily identifiable, but there's a whole lot going on beyond the surface, beyond the curtain, as it rises and you start further investigating the system. And as you can see, we have the Cape May warbler and the black-throated green, yellow rump, bay-breasted, and black burnian. And this was MacArthur's way of showing the use of a black spruce as it relates to where that bird was nesting in the boreal forest zone. Well, so also goes where the drainage applies to these large mound nests that are incorporated within Carex pennsylvanica. And on the periphery of the nest, as you first saw when I introduced the mesic environment and Carex pennsylvanica occurring on the periphery, will these different ant species be nesting on the periphery and living with Formica subsericea, but not socially interacting with them. They are usually smaller species, such as Solenopsis molesta, Brachymyrmex depilus that I showed earlier, and Lasius flavus, and a whole multitude of species. So there may be 20 to 30 additional ant species that are nesting just within one mound nest of Formica subsericea. So I had mentioned logs or recently fallen wood or just woody detritus within woodlands. And so we gauge the decomposition of these fallen trees from stage 1 to stage 5. So stage 1 is where you have a recently fallen tree and the bark is loose. Stage 2, you have the cambium that is starting to soften. Stage 3 to 5, you have where the heartwood starts to soften, and or stage 3 to 4. And then stage 5 is where the tree is no longer recognizable within the environment, except from the coloration of the highly decomposed wood, which in the stage 5 portion of that log or fallen tree, and it's incredible at the diversity in these highly decomposed substrates. In fact, there are species that only nest within that substrate, and only when that substrate within woodland systems are have access to the sun throughout the day. So these savanna systems, or whatever we're calling it, I have a hard time with saying that is a savanna, that is an open oak woods, because really these systems are defined by their plant species composition, the faunal components, and other variables that really have no name. We like to put names on things, but often they are broad definitions. But within this fallen log, for example, it is variable because you may have recently, the loosened bark, but you may at the soil surface have, stage 3 to 4, and then stage 5 portions of that log that are represented, hosting a coterie of species within that. So Lasius imbratus, for example, that would build a nest, a soil mound around Carex stricta, but using it as a substrate in a watery environment, but simulating an upland environment, and then building a mound in the mesic phases, but using the log or the decomposed wood of upland environments because of the moisture and the specific heat of water. So this is Lasius imbratus. Here's 2 and 3. I'm kind of going backwards, but this is what stage 2 to 3 looks like. And one species that nests within these logs in these upland environments is Camponotus novaboricensis. And this species, now it can be found throughout the Catina, but in the wetland environment, it is intimately allied with Carex stricta and Carex haydenii, in that the log of the upland is the analog for the Carex stricta hummock, because it is able to excavate these Carex stricta hummocks or stools and create a large gallery or cavity within these hummocks. So that is very interesting. Formica glacialis, now this is an open environment. So here's a species that nests within the decomposed wood of upland environments, but this is a strong mesophile. And as you can see, we have Carex stricta, Carex pallida, there's Carex communis at the apex, along with Carex pennsylvanica, and that is a mound nest that went up to my hip. So, and the photo does not even come close to the enormity of this sedge mound. So myrmecochory, this is a very important concept to relate, in that we have these guilds, like Carex pennsylvanica. When we restore woodlands, for example, restoring them back to their remnant state, we will see that the Carex pennsylvanica lawn, once restored in with fire, that these other related plants that are dispersed by ants also are a part of that system. You usually will find communities of plants that are largely ant dispersed. And what does myrmecochory mean? Well, myrmekos is Greek for ant, and chori means, or chorus, means distributed or farmed. And why would they do that? Well, because there is a reward on the perigenium of, since we're talking about sedges, and I had shortly mentioned it, but members of the Acrocystis section they have at the base, in fact, in Paul's book, he has a gorgeous picture of Carex communis where it's very fresh and you can see how it's tumescent at the base and differing in texture and coloration. And the interesting aspect through coevolution is that plants have married their chemistry of these Myrmecochorus species with that of insects. Okay, so the chemistry is largely oleic and linoleic acids, principally diolene, and that marries and varies from the actual chemistry of the seed itself compared to that of insects. Now, the ants do not have masticating mouth parts, even though they are toothed, but they have sucking. They suck the hemolymph, which is the blood of insects, and which is largely comprised of these oleic and linoleic acids. Well, the coevolution of these species that are ant dispersed also have those similar chemistries located in the aleosome. Stenema brevicorni, which is another species that is never found or very rarely in woodlands or wooded systems that are absent of organic matter or extremely degraded, and is one of the dispersers of Carex pennsylvanica seeds or Paragenia, and carrying it like a little torch. And it's a very tiny species that nests in the leaf litter and often in the A1 horizon and O horizon, which is the organic layer. Carex umbellata is another species that has the stipe, or the base of the plant, is loaded with it has an aleosome, but the oil. And here we have, it's in our region, in the Chicago region, it's a species of savannas, but also in calcareous environments as well. And this is a dry to dry mesic gravel hill prairie. And very interesting is that many of these species, as you can see, the spikes are principally located at the base of the cespitose clump, and that is where, when they finally mature, they will be located at about the level where the ants are at. And there's a whole cohort of ant species that are affiliated with those systems. Carex laxicolmus that we have been studying here in the woodlands in southern Indiana. This is another species that is ant dispersed, and as you can see, at the base, and this is a dried Paragenium, but it is very turgid when it is fresh. And note the pendulant spikes on their peduncles as they approach the forest floor, allowing the ants immediate access to the Paragenia. Now, why would the ants disperse the seeds? Well, because of the chemistry involved in the aleosomes, it actually is like a pheromone and stimulates the response of brood transport. And so this whole phenomenon is very interesting when you start understanding why myrmecochory has evolved. Carex pedunculata in the clandestini section, and this is a fresh Paragenium, and with the aleosome, which is extremely large. And this is a species that lives in our area, very high quality mesic slopes, usually north facing and in calcareous environments. Carex subanescens would be nesting, Formica subanescens would be nesting in this environment. Carex jamesii, and I'm sure other species of the Phyllostachyi section are also myrmecochorous, but Carex jamesii absolutely is, and the base of the Paragenium is the aleosome. Now I bring up Hepatica, the two Hepatica species that we have, Acutaloba and Americana. Notice how it is very Paragenia-like, and it is a myrmecochorous plant. And note the aleosome at the basal portion of the seed. Other graminoids, such as in the Juncaceae, all members of the genus Luzula, and this is a species called Luzula multiflora. Instead of it being basally disposed, the aleosome is apical in nature, and these are dried seeds. You will see, for those of you that are going out in woodlands today on your field trips, note some of these slides and these Myrmecoccus cohorts of plants that are usually affiliated with one another, and especially within the vernal window of the growing season, which most plant species that do have myrmecoccery do reside within that window. So in wooded environments, it is an extremely common phenomenon. And then, of course, Claytonia virginica, although not a sedge, but a myrmecoccus plant. And this is a extremely very dry seed of Claytonia virginica, but that white portion that it was once fleshy is very tumescent and filled with water or turgid with the, water-like, but actually the oils. But without the dispersal of the ants, then we would not have the ability of the plant possibly to be away from the parent plant. So it increases the fitness of the plant being moved away, but also pollination. So this is Andrena erigenii, which is a monolectic bee and taking the pollen only from Claytonia, that genus, and in our area, Claytonia virginica. The other interesting thing is that by removing it far from the parent plant, and usually in woodlands, because within the vernal window we're dealing with that cohort that is affiliated with woodlands, these are nutrient-poor environments, but within the sedge, the sedge and ant colony, these are nutrient-rich environments that are replete with nutrients integral to plants, such as sulfur, phosphorus, potassium, etc. And our viola species, every single member, and that usually has a little tiny tuft that is the aleosome and fat-rich body. But this is one of those plants or groups of plants that has a dual purpose of distributing its seeds, and that is through diplockery, having a dual mode, both autochorous, meaning by itself, in the ballistic sense, by popping its capsules and then literally throwing the seeds from the action, the elastic action of the capsule opening, but also they can, the flowers and the ovaries later in the season will droop down at or near the soil surface, and the dehiscence, the lack of water of the capsule will allow them to open up, and then hence the seeds are quickly exposed. Endodeca serpentaria is also one of these members. And again, you'll see that the central portion is where the aleosome is located and always affiliated with these groups of other species that are myrmecoccus. Acerum canadense is quite flamboyant, the aleosome. And all of our trilliums as well. Corydalus flabula and other members of that genus. Jeffersonia diphylla, quite flamboyant, and this is a fresh aleosome. The white portion is the aleosome. And both of our dicentra species, it is hyaline in this photograph, but it is white and clear in hyaline when fresh. Now, there are other species that are interspersed, and we find them, not only just like viola, are they distributed by ants because they do possess an aleosome, but they also, through a vector, are moved throughout the environment, so would be a diplockerous group of plants. And so this is Gallium cerzezans, hypomalicum, but just broadly Gallium cerzezans. And because we're dealing with the Rubiaceae, it produces 2 ovaries, but one often becomes aborted, and that would be the aleosome. So Here's the aborted ovary. And when you touch the plant, I was showing students yesterday because we were studying Gallium apirinine, which was also showing the aborted fruits and the aleosome. And you have to be very careful because here the fruits are ripe and you barely touch it and it just pops right off. And so it is filled with the oleic and linoleic acids, fatty acids, stimulating carrying and transport. Sanguinaria canadensis is another species. So 30% of our woodland flora are ant dispersed, besides the sedges. And then when we move to open environments, our Polygala species and Polygala seneca and sanguinea, and it's bifurcate the aleosome. And that's a short and sweet, barely evident synopsis of ants with sedges and other plants within the system. We can go on and on. Are there any questions? Yes.
So you alluded to the ants overwintering near the tops of Carex stricta. If they're ectothermic, as you say, how do they manage to survive? I really don't know much about that.
Oh, okay. And so they survive actually at the base of these Carex stricta stools. So they are right at the water line, just above it, but not immersed in the water. And then I'll bring up something also related to that. It's because of the average annual daily temperature to where it may be, 20 below, but because the water is still flowing, especially within discharge wetlands where you do have water movement, those are warmer microsites within the system that never freeze. So that's an excellent question. The other thing as well is that when you look at ants, and because, we're dealing with, the outside exoskeleton of the ants, they can even be submerged within these environments. But when you look at them, you have water bubbles that are completely impregnating, or the outside, or covering the outside of their body. So they are not completely submerged within these systems. And I discovered that with Carex grayi and in a recently flooded meadow that was just because of a rainstorm, and the nest had still survived because, and the workers involved with it, because they were not completely, the hydrophobic nature of the exoskeleton disallowed the complete immersion in water, should I say. Stephanie.
Yeah, thanks for your talk, Laura. With the alliazomes and Carex, I was curious about what Tony shared yesterday, that vestigial flagella. Are those related at all? Are they in the same location?
They would be about in the same location. Tony?
The eliasome part is actually part of the perigenium, not developed from either the axis or the vestigial flagella, which in fact are inside that. So it's developed from the base of the perigenium, the little profile.
Thank you, Tony. Yes.
I don't know if people can hear. Excuse me. So you talk about the graminoid root system and the
Yes.
ant's relationship to the graminoid root system. Then you talked about the eliosomes, and you mentioned the eliosomes in Carex and the eliosomes in all these other mostly spring ephemeral species. Are there other root systems besides graminoid root systems in which ants do the same sort of thing?
Yes, but not as largely. So, for example, forbs in the broadest sense. There are ants that do affiliate, but very weakly so with forbs, such as the genus Solidago. It's not as fibrous. It's just not as good of a medium substrate below grade for ants. But they do affiliate, and you will see throughout the flora of the Chicago region that I did discuss that. But not, when we look at an open environment, and if we're talking about the Asteraceae, these are not rhizomatously often spreading species that can form a lawn, okay? Usually you just have a root caudex, and depending upon the age of the system, you know, these root caudices can be quite ancient, where you have multiple culms coming out of the same root caudex, but they don't have that widespread prevailing nature that the graminoids offer, and especially in the fibrous root zone, to where there's a central nexus and it's the fine roots that are at or near the surface. And usually, and if we're talking about mollisols are created principally because of the graminoids that are within, that's part of their definition. I saw some other, yes. Yes, Greg.
So the traditional story, the very simplistic story that I always think about with the rhizomes, maybe you showed this with some before, was like that there's a food reward, and that's what the ants are responding to.
Yes.
You really touched on like
Oh.
a bunch of other things, like the oleic acid is potentially mimicking the dispersal hormone, and you talked about the hemolymph being larvae.
Yes, okay.
So yeah, I'm curious about
Yes.
specifically Carex versus some of the other.
Yes, and they have the same paradigm. So they themselves, the workers, the worker caste, the ergates, ergos is work, they will bring it back to the nest and feed it to their larvae and developing larvae. And so because we're dealing with a mutualism that is altruistic in nature because of the superorganism called an ant nest, because they are social. Each of these, whether it be from a sedge or grass or a forb, and if they possess aleosomes, it's that general chemistry that they have within the aleosome that stimulates the brood transport mechanism in the ants to bring it back to the nest. Now, these are largely, instead of the largely nectar feeding ants, the omnivorous class of ants that are more stimulated to transport the seeds back to the nest. But depending upon the quality of the aleosome, they may not wholly bring it back to the nest. It may be dropped and picked up. It may be brought back by other ants, but they are directly stimulated by that chemistry of those fatty acids that mirror their primary diet throughout the growing season, which would be insects. Okay? Yes, Tony.
Have people checked the temperatures of these nests? Because I'm curious, you mentioned so much organic matter being
Yes.
incorporated. Are they composting to raise the temperature even above the temperature of the water that you mentioned?
Yes, that's an excellent question. In fact, this is largely from my work that I was going out and just obsessed with the temperature probe and understanding why are these ants principally associated with the sedges and the graminoids, the grasses, and they are bringing, because of the perennial nature of the ants, they're bringing up roots and shredding, constantly shredding plant parts, bringing it up towards the surface, and also incorporating it. And then because they also, through respiration, they excrete and contributing to the humus environment that is closely associated with the root zone of the plant, and which will vary and be extremely stable in that very shallow area to where the interface with the atmosphere and temperature fluctuation because of the specific heat of water, because we have our soil organic matter, which is humus, and the high water holding capacity, which I did not mention, of organic matter. It has 20% by weight, 20% water holding capacity compared to similar soils, which is quickly lost. And that's because of the large surface area of the colloids, which are tiny, microscopic surface area, but with water and with the nutrients involved. But the mediating aspect or function of soil organic matter as it is concentrated around the root zone, and because of the activities of the ants, keeps that microsite extremely stable in temperature and non-fluctuating, as that diagram earlier in the slide program showed, where you saw we could not reach near air temperature of 72 degrees unless we were 20 centimeters below grade within that purely mineral environment absent of organic matter. That's why within our lawns, you'll see that there's just a small cohort of ants that are able to nest within these very dire systems, because they nest well below where temperature fluctuations are manifest. And so these are deep soil nesters, one of them being Lasius neoniger, Tetramorium cespetum. That species is adventive. And so they are adapted to escape that temperature modulation.
Thank you. To be continued over lunch and field work.